The moment Barron Trump called Congresswoman Cori Bush a ghetto congresswoman during the Georgetown University political forum, the auditorium fell into shocked silence. But Bush didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, the knowing smile of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. What she pulled out of her phone next wasn't just a recording that would destroy Barron's political future. It was audio evidence that would expose the Trump family's true beliefs about Black Americans and end any hope he had of following in his father's footsteps. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of the explosive political drama we cover. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when America's most privileged teenager learns that some people fight back harder than he ever imagined. This wasn't just another college debate. This was the moment when generational privilege collided with lived experience, when casual racism met systematic preparation, and when the Trump family's carefully crafted public image was about to be shattered by someone who had survived everything they had never had to face. The Georgetown University Political Forum had been buzzing with anticipation for weeks. The event, titled The Future of American Politics, Next Generation Voices, was supposed to showcase emerging political talent and give students a chance to engage with established leaders. What it was about to become was the most explosive political confrontation in university history. Barron Trump, now 18 years old and a freshman at Georgetown, had emerged as the surprise star of the university's political science department. Standing nearly 6 feet 8 inches and possessing his father's commanding presence without the obvious controversy, Barron had been carefully positioning himself as the future of conservative politics. Unlike his older siblings who had jumped straight into business and politics, Barron had chosen the academic route, studying political science and constitutional law with the apparent goal of eventually running for office himself. His professors described him as exceptionally intelligent and politically sophisticated beyond his years. He had never lost a debate in his freshman year, and his combination of Trump name recognition with apparent intellectual depth had made him a campus celebrity. The Georgetown Young Republicans had tripled in membership since his enrollment, and political operatives from both parties were already taking notice of his potential. Tonight's forum was supposed to be Barron's coming-out moment on the national stage. The event was being live-streamed, C-SPAN was recording for later broadcast, and major political reporters had traveled to Georgetown specifically to see the youngest Trump in action. This was his opportunity to show America that the Trump political dynasty had a new, more sophisticated voice. But Barron had made a critical error in preparation. He had agreed to debate Congresswoman Cori Bush, the 44-year-old representative from Missouri's 1st Congressional District, without fully understanding who he was facing. Cori Bush's journey to Congress was unlike that of any other member of the House. Born into poverty in St. Louis, she had experienced homelessness as a young mother, living in her car with her children while working multiple jobs to survive. She had worked as a nurse, a pastor, and a community organizer before finding her political voice during the Ferguson protests following Michael Brown's death in 2014. Bush had been on the front lines of the Black Lives Matter movement, facing tear gas and police brutality while demanding justice for victims of police violence. She had spent nights sleeping in tents outside the St. Louis courthouse, had been arrested multiple times for civil disobedience, and had risked her life to document police violence against protesters. Her rise to Congress in 2020 had been one of the most remarkable political stories of that election cycle. Running as a progressive challenger against a longtime incumbent, Bush had overcome massive financial disadvantages to win a stunning primary upset. Her victory was powered by grassroots organizing in communities that had been ignored by traditional politics. In Congress, Bush had quickly established herself as one of the most fearless voices for racial justice and economic equality. She had slept on the Capitol steps to protest the end of the eviction moratorium, had been arrested protesting at the Supreme Court, and had never hesitated to call out racism and inequality wherever she found it. What made Bush particularly dangerous as a debate opponent wasn't just her political courage or her compelling life story. It was her intelligence and her preparation. Despite not having an Ivy League education or elite political connections, Bush had developed a sophisticated understanding of policy and politics that consistently surprised her opponents. She did her homework, she prepared for every battle, and she never underestimated anyone, especially privileged opponents who underestimated her. The topic for tonight's debate was generational change in American politics, a seemingly safe subject that was supposed to allow both participants to discuss their visions for the future. Barron's team had prepared him for a philosophical discussion about political evolution and the role of young voices in democracy. What they hadn't prepared him for was the possibility that Bush had her own agenda for the evening. The auditorium was packed beyond capacity, with students sitting in aisles and standing along the walls. The energy was electric as the audience sensed they were about to witness something historic. Political journalists filled the front rows, their cameras and recording devices ready to capture every moment of what many expected would be Barron Trump's national political debut. The moderator, Georgetown political science professor Dr. Sarah Martinez, introduced both participants to enthusiastic applause. Barron entered from stage left, towering over everyone around him, wearing a perfectly tailored Navy suit that emphasized his commanding physical presence. He waved to the crowd with the natural confidence of someone who had grown up in the spotlight. Bush entered from stage right, wearing a simple but elegant black blazer and her signature natural hair in a protective style. At 5 feet 4 inches, she was dwarfed by Barron's height, but her presence filled the stage in a different way. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had survived everything life could throw at her and emerged stronger. The contrast was striking and loaded with symbolism. The towering heir to American political dynasty facing the woman who had fought her way from homelessness to Congress. The visual alone told a story about privilege and struggle, about inherited power and earned authority. Dr. Martinez opened with introductions and ground rules before posing the first question about what each participant saw as the biggest challenges facing their generation in politics. Bush spoke first, discussing the need for authentic representation and politicians who understood the struggles of working families. Her response was thoughtful and personal, drawing on her own experiences while connecting them to broader policy issues. Then it was Barron's turn. He stood up to deliver his response, using his height advantage to command the room's attention. His opening was polished and sophisticated, discussing constitutional principles and democratic institutions with the fluency of someone who had been studying political theory his entire life. "The greatest challenge facing my generation," Barron said, his voice carrying easily through the large auditorium, "is restoring respect for constitutional principles and traditional American values. Too many young politicians today are more interested in performative politics and social media attention than in actually governing." It was a subtle but clear shot at progressive politicians like Bush, delivered with the kind of coded language that allowed for plausible deniability while making his meaning clear to those who understood political messaging. Bush noticed the attack, but didn't respond immediately. She had been in enough political battles to recognize when someone was trying to bait her into an emotional response. Instead, she made a note and waited for her opportunity. The debate continued for 20 minutes with both participants staying relatively cordial, discussing policy differences and generational perspectives without personal attacks. Barron was clearly winning on style points. His height, his polish, and his academic preparation were all working in his favor. Several students in the audience were nodding approvingly at his responses. But those who knew Bush well could see that she was studying her opponent, watching his patterns, and waiting for the right moment. She had noticed something in Barron's demeanor and language that suggested he was more like his father than his public image suggested. The turning point came when Dr. Martinez asked about criminal justice reform and the role of protest in American democracy. Bush gave a passionate response about her experiences in Ferguson and the need for police accountability, drawing on her personal experiences with police violence and her work as a nurse treating victims of police brutality. Barron's response was when everything changed. "I respect Congresswoman Bush's experiences," he began, standing up again to use his height advantage. "But I think we need to be careful about letting emotional reactions drive policy decisions. The reality is that law and order is essential for a functioning society, and some communities have cultural problems that can't be solved by changing police procedures." The phrase "cultural problems" hung in the air like a warning sign. Bush's expression didn't change, but anyone watching closely could see her eyes narrow slightly. "When we have politicians who come from these troubled communities," Barron continued, apparently unaware that he was walking into dangerous territory, "they sometimes bring the dysfunction of their backgrounds into the political process. We need leaders who understand how to work within the system, not people who want to tear it down. The audience was beginning to shift uncomfortably. Even supportive students were recognizing that Barron was using language that sounded suspiciously like racial coding. But he wasn't finished. I mean, look at some of the protests we've seen in recent years. The looting, the violence, the destruction of property. That's not political protest. That's criminal behavior. And when politicians encourage that kind of activity or make excuses for it, they're undermining the rule of law. Bush remained calm, but her voice carried a new edge when she responded. Mr. Trump, I think you might want to be more careful about characterizing communities you clearly don't understand. The protests I participated in were about demanding justice for murder victims. When you dismiss that as criminal behavior, you're showing exactly the kind of privileged ignorance that makes real change impossible. It was a measured response, but Barron apparently took it as a challenge to escalate further. Congresswoman Bush, with all due respect, your background doesn't exactly qualify you to lecture me about law and order. You've been arrested multiple times, you've participated in illegal protests, and you represent exactly the kind of ghetto politics that's destroying American cities. The word ghetto hit the auditorium like a physical blow. Students gasped audibly, several people stood up in their seats, and even the journalists in the front row looked shocked by the blatant racism of the comment. But Bush didn't look shocked. She looked satisfied. Did you just call me a ghetto congresswoman, Mr. Trump? She asked, her voice steady but with an unmistakable undercurrent of steel. Barron seemed to realize he had crossed a line, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. I said you represent ghetto politics, the kind of divisive, destructive approach that prioritizes grievance over governance. If that offends you, maybe you should examine whether your own behavior fits the description. The auditorium was in chaos now, with students shouting and professors trying to restore order. But Bush raised her hand for silence, and somehow her quiet authority commanded the room's attention. That's very interesting, Mr. Trump, she said, reaching into her purse and pulling out her smartphone. Because what you just said reminds me of something I think this audience needs to hear. She held up the phone, and suddenly the auditorium's sound system crackled to life with crystal clear audio. The voice was unmistakably Barron's. Younger, but clearly recognizable. I mean, these people from the ghetto, they don't understand how civilized society works. They think everything is about race, but really it's about culture. Some cultures are just more primitive than others. The auditorium fell completely silent as the recording continued. My dad's right about these congresswomen like that Bush woman and AOC. They're not really Americans, you know? They come from these failed communities and they want to drag the whole country down to their level. Another voice, unfamiliar to most listeners, asked, So you think black politicians are inherently problematic? Barron's recorded voice responded without hesitation. Not all of them, but the ones from the hood definitely are. They bring ghetto mentality into politics. Like, they can't help it. It's how they were raised. In broken families, in violent neighborhoods, on welfare. That's not America. The recording was devastating, but Bush wasn't finished. She let it continue. The worst part is how they play the victim card constantly. Like this Cori Bush woman. She talks about being homeless like it's some kind of qualification for office. If she was homeless, it's probably because she made bad choices. Responsible people don't end up living in cars. Several students in the audience were crying now. Others were shouting in anger, but Bush commanded silence as the recording reached its most damaging portion. Honestly, people like her shouldn't be in Congress. The founders never intended for welfare queens and ghetto activists to have political power. They wanted educated, successful people, people like our family, to run the country. The unknown voice asked, Do you really think being poor disqualifies someone from political office? Barron's response was the final nail in his political coffin. Being poor isn't the problem. Being ghetto is. There's a difference between temporarily struggling financially and having a ghetto mentality. People like Bush, they think the world owes them something because of their background. They're victims by choice. Bush stopped the recording and looked directly at Barron, who was sitting frozen in his chair, his face drained of all color. That recording was made 3 weeks ago, Bush said, her voice carrying clearly through the completely silent auditorium. At a private dinner party here in Georgetown, attended by several young Republican organizers. One of them felt that your views needed to be shared with a broader audience. She stood up, using her full presence to command the room despite her smaller stature. You want to talk about qualifications, Mr. Trump? Let me tell you about mine. I've been homeless. Yes, not because I made bad choices, but because I was a teenage mother working multiple minimum wage jobs in an economy that doesn't pay living wages. I lived in my car with my children because housing costs more than poor people earn. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. I've been a nurse, caring for patients who couldn't afford health care. I've been a pastor, providing spiritual guidance to communities that have been abandoned by society. I've been a community organizer, fighting for people who have no voice in the political process. Bush moved closer to Barron, her presence somehow making his 6 feet 8 inches frame seem smaller. And yes, I've been arrested for protesting the murder of unarmed black men and women. I've been tear-gassed for demanding justice. I've been beaten by police for documenting their violence against peaceful protesters. The auditorium was completely silent except for her voice. Those experiences didn't disqualify me for office, Mr. Trump. They qualified me in ways that your privileged upbringing never could. Because when you've experienced injustice personally, when you've lived through poverty and discrimination and violence, you understand what government can do to help people and what it does to hurt them. She turned to face the audience, including the cameras that were broadcasting this moment to the nation. Mr. Trump thinks being poor is a character flaw. He thinks experiencing homelessness disqualifies you from political leadership. He thinks coming from what he calls the ghetto makes you somehow less American. Her voice rose with righteous anger. But I'm here to tell you that some of the most patriotic Americans I know are people who have struggled and survived. Some of the wisest political voices come from people who have experienced what it's like when government fails its citizens. Bush turned back to Barron, who still hadn't spoken since the recording played. You talk about ghetto politics, Mr. Trump, but what you really mean is politics that include people you don't think matter. Politics that center the experiences of people who look like me, who come from communities like mine, who have survived challenges you can't even imagine. She leaned forward slightly, her intensity filling the space between them. You think your family's wealth and power make you more qualified to lead than someone who has actually lived through the problems government is supposed to solve. You think being born on third base makes you a better baseball player than someone who fought their way to first. The metaphor hit perfectly, and several students nodded in recognition. But here's what you don't understand, Mr. Trump. America isn't a country club. It's not supposed to be run by people who inherited their position. It's supposed to be a democracy where anyone can rise through service and sacrifice and hard work. Bush's voice dropped to a quieter but more intense level. When you call me a ghetto congresswoman, you're not just insulting me. You're insulting every American who has ever struggled financially, every person who has experienced homelessness, every community that has been written off by people like you. She stood to her full height, somehow commanding the room despite being dwarfed by Barron's physical presence. You're insulting the American dream itself, the idea that where you come from doesn't determine where you can go, that your circumstances don't define your potential, that democracy means everyone gets a voice. The auditorium erupted in sustained applause, but Bush wasn't finished. That recording you just heard isn't just about me, Mr. Trump. It reveals what you really think about millions of Americans. It shows that underneath your polished presentation and your expensive education, you have the same prejudices, the same contempt for working people, the same belief that wealth equals worth that has always been the enemy of democratic equality. She gathered her materials as if preparing to leave. You asked about qualifications earlier. Here are mine. I've lived through poverty and survived. I've faced violence and stood up. I've experienced injustice and fought back. I've seen government fail people and dedicated my life to making it work better. Bush looked directly into the cameras. Those aren't disqualifications for political leadership. Those are exactly the qualifications democracy needs. She turned back to Barron one last time. As for you, Mr. Trump, you've just shown this audience and this country exactly who you really are. Not the polished, intellectual future leader your handlers want people to see, but someone who believes that being born wealthy makes you inherently superior to people who earned their position through struggle and service. The final blow was delivered with devastating calm. The American people will decide whether they want leaders who have lived their challenges or leaders who have never faced any challenges at all. whether they want representatives who understand their struggles or representatives who look down on them for having struggles. She walked toward the exit, then turned back for one final comment. "Oh, and Mr. Trump? The next time you want to use racist language to describe a black congresswoman, you might want to make sure that Congresswoman hasn't spent her entire political career documenting exactly this kind of behavior." Bush left the stage to thunderous applause, leaving Barron sitting alone at the debate table, completely speechless for the first time in his political life. The aftermath was immediate and catastrophic for Barron Trump's political future. Within minutes of Bush's devastating exposure, social media exploded with clips of the recording and her response. #GhettoCongressWoman began trending ironically, with millions of Americans sharing stories of their own struggles and celebrating Bush's defense of working-class dignity. The hashtag Barron Exposed followed closely behind, with political commentators and ordinary citizens alike expressing shock at the blatant racism revealed in the recording. Conservative supporters who had seen Barron as the future of a more sophisticated Republican Party found themselves unable to defend language that was openly contemptuous of poor and minority Americans. Major news networks interrupted their regular programming to cover the story. CNN's breaking news banner read, "Trump airs racist comments exposed at Georgetown debate." Fox News, typically supportive of the Trump family, struggled to find a defense for Barron's recorded statements, with several commentators expressing disappointment in what they called unforced errors. The recording itself became the most shared political audio in social media history. Unlike many political controversies that could be dismissed as taken out of context, Barron's own words were clear, extended, and impossible to misinterpret. He had spent several minutes expressing views that were openly racist and classist, views that contradicted everything he had said publicly about unifying conservative politics. Georgetown University's administration found itself in crisis mode. Student protesters gathered outside the auditorium, demanding accountability for what they saw as the university's platform for hate speech. The Georgetown Black Student Union called for Barron's expulsion, while the Student Government Association passed an emergency resolution condemning his comments. More damaging was the response from Republican political figures who had been quietly grooming Barron as a future leader. Senator Tim Scott, the Republican Party's most prominent black member, issued a statement calling Barron's comments completely unacceptable and contrary to conservative values. Governor Glenn Youngkin of Virginia, who had been mentoring Barron on political strategy, canceled their upcoming meetings and distanced himself from the young Trump. Even some Trump family allies struggled to defend the recording. Steve Bannon, typically loyal to anything Trump-related, told his podcast audience that Barron's comments were politically stupid and showed he wasn't ready for national politics. Tucker Carlson, usually a reliable Trump defender, spent his show discussing how young politicians need to understand that everything they say can become public. The most significant political damage came from Donald Trump himself. The former president, known for defending his family members regardless of circumstances, issued only a brief statement. Barron is young and learning. Everyone deserves a chance to grow from their mistakes. The notably restrained response suggested that even Trump recognized how damaging the recording was to the family's political brand. For Cori Bush, the confrontation represented a complete vindication of her political courage and strategic thinking. The congresswoman who had been dismissed by many as too radical or too confrontational had just delivered one of the most effective political performances in recent memory. Her response to Barron's attack had been both morally powerful and tactically brilliant. The recording she played hadn't been a lucky discovery. It had been the result of careful intelligence gathering by her political network. Bush had allies throughout Washington's progressive movement, including young staffers and activists who kept her informed about conservative political activities. When one of these sources had brought her the recording 3 weeks earlier, she had immediately recognized its potential importance. Rather than releasing it immediately for maximum shock value, Bush had made the strategic decision to wait for the right moment. She understood that the recording would be most powerful if it came in direct response to Barron making similar comments publicly. By allowing him to attack her first, she had created the perfect context for revealing his private beliefs. The tactical brilliance of her approach was widely praised by political strategists from both parties. Democratic consultant James Carville called it one of the most perfectly executed political takedowns I've ever seen. Republican strategist Rick Wilson, a frequent Trump critic, wrote that Bush had played chess while Barron was playing checkers. But beyond the tactical success, Bush's response had struck a deeper chord with Americans who had experienced economic struggle or social prejudice. Her defense of working-class dignity and her insistence that surviving hardship qualified rather than disqualified someone for leadership resonated with millions of voters who had felt looked down upon by wealthy politicians. The broader implications for American politics were profound. The confrontation had exposed the tensions within conservative politics between populist rhetoric about supporting working Americans and elitist attitudes toward people who had actually experienced economic hardship. Barron's comments had revealed that at least some conservative leaders viewed poor Americans with contempt rather than concern. For the Republican Party, the incident represented a strategic disaster. Party leaders had been hoping that Barron could eventually help them appeal to younger and more diverse voters while maintaining their conservative base. His racist comments had destroyed that possibility while reinforcing negative stereotypes about Republican attitudes toward minority and working-class Americans. The incident also highlighted the growing political power of politicians with working-class backgrounds. Bush, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and other representatives who had experienced economic hardship were proving that their lived experiences gave them unique credibility and moral authority that traditional politicians couldn't match. 3 weeks after the Georgetown confrontation, Barron Trump withdrew from Georgetown University, citing security concerns and family considerations. Political insiders understood that his political career was effectively over before it had begun. The recording had made it impossible for him to appeal to minority voters, working-class voters, or moderate Republicans who found his comments offensive. The young man who had been seen as the future of sophisticated conservative politics had instead become a symbol of the prejudices that many Americans associated with elite Republican circles. His fall from political grace was complete and seemingly irreversible. Cori Bush, meanwhile, saw her national profile reach new heights. Speaking requests poured in from across the country, her fundraising numbers skyrocketed, and political commentators began discussing her as a potential future leader of progressive politics. More importantly, her confrontation with Barron had inspired countless Americans who had experienced economic hardship to see their backgrounds as sources of strength rather than shame. The confrontation became a case study in political preparation, moral courage, and the power of authentic leadership. Bush had proven that when privileged politicians underestimated working-class leaders, they did so at their own peril. But perhaps the most important outcome was the broader conversation about who deserves political power in America. Bush's response to Barron had articulated a vision of democracy where lived experience with struggle and injustice qualified someone for leadership rather than disqualifying them. In the end, the Georgetown University Political Forum had indeed showcased the future of American politics, just not in the way anyone had expected. Instead of launching Barron Trump's political career, it had demonstrated the political power of authentic leaders who had earned their positions through service and sacrifice rather than inheritance and privilege. The lesson was clear. In American democracy, where you come from matters less than what you do with the opportunities you're given. And sometimes, the people who have struggled the most are exactly the leaders the country needs most. As Bush concluded in her follow-up interviews, democracy isn't about perfect people from perfect backgrounds leading imperfect people. It's about real people who understand real problems working together to create real solutions. That's not ghetto politics. That's American politics at its best. The recording that was supposed to destroy her career had instead revealed the character of both participants. And in that revelation, America had seen exactly the kind of leadership it needed for the challenges ahead.